When we picture D-Day, we picture the landing. We picture the ramps of the landing craft dropping and the men running out onto the beaches of Normandy. It is the most famous, most defining image of the entire Second World War. But in all of history, no single piece of technology has been so critical to victory and yet so completely forgotten as the boat that made that moment possible. Because in 1940, the boat that would land the Allies on Omaha Beach did not exist. And according to the combined wisdom of every major navy in the world, it could not exist. To understand why, you have to go back. You have to understand that for 20 years, the highest levels of military command in both America and Britain were haunted by one word: Gallipoli. In 1915, during the First World War, the Allies, led by Winston Churchill, had tried to land an army on the beaches of Gallipoli in Turkey. It was, up to that time, the largest amphibious invasion in history. And it was a catastrophe of such epic proportions that it was seared into the minds of every general and admiral for the next generation. The problem was simple. How do you get men from a ship to a beach while another man is shooting at you with a machine gun? At Gallipoli, they had no good answer. The British famously ran a converted merchant ship, the River Clyde, aground, and the men were supposed to run down wooden ramps. The Turkish machine guns opened up, and the ramps became a river of blood. In other places, the soldiers were packed into slow, open, wooden rowboats, towed by small steam launches. They were sitting ducks. They were slaughtered before their boats ever even touched the sand. The lesson of Gallipoli was clear, and it was brutal. A frontal assault on a defended beach was suicide. For the next 20 years, this was the accepted, unquestioned military doctrine. The problem of the defended beach was considered, quite literally, impossible to solve. The United States Navy, in the 1920s and 1930s, had an official solution. It was a 30-foot-long boat designed by the Navy's own Bureau of Construction and Repair, and it was a complete failure. It was a double-ended boat, meaning it had a rudder at both the front and the back. It was slow, and it was heavy. But its greatest flaw was its design. It was a deep V hull, just like any other ocean-going boat. This meant it could not actually run up onto the beach. The propeller, or screw, was exposed deep beneath the boat. The pilot would have to stop at the first sandbar, often 50 or 100 yards away from the dry beach, and the men would have to jump out in deep water and wade. This was not a solution. This was just Gallipoli all over again. A 100-yard killing zone for every man. The one group of men who knew this was a disaster was the United States Marine Corps. Their entire job was to conduct amphibious landings. And in the 1930s, as they ran war games and exercises in the Caribbean, they were screaming at the Navy. They were desperate. These boats were getting them killed, even in practice. The Marines knew that a V-hull boat was useless. They knew a boat that had to be backed off a beach would get stuck. They knew that climbing over the high steel sides was a death trap. They needed a miracle boat, a boat that did not exist. They needed a boat that could run at high speed, in water that was only inches deep. They needed a boat that could run directly onto a sand beach without destroying its propeller. They needed a boat that could unload its men instantly from the front. And they needed a boat that could then back itself off the beach in seconds and return to the ship for another load. Every single naval architect at the Navy's Bureau said this was impossible, but it was not impossible, because at that exact same time, that miracle boat, was already being built. It was not being built in a high-tech naval yard. It was being built in a small, chaotic, noisy workshop in New Orleans by a hard-drinking, profane, and brilliant Irishman who was building it for loggers and trappers in the Louisiana swamps. His name was Andrew Jackson Higgins. Andrew Jackson Higgins was the furthest thing from a polished naval architect. He was a brash, loud-mouthed, and brilliant industrialist from Nebraska who had set up shop in New Orleans. His company, Higgins Industries, did not build yachts. It built tough, rugged workboats for the oil and gas and lumber industries of the Deep South. Higgins was a man who understood the swamps. He understood mud and cypress stumps and shallow water. The problem his customers faced was simple. A standard boat with a propeller and rudder hanging below the hull was useless in the Louisiana bayou. It would be destroyed in minutes, sheared off by a hidden log, or hopelessly fouled in mud. So in the 1920s, Higgins had invented a boat called the Eureka. It was a marvel of practical engineering. His solution was to recess the propeller. He designed a shallow draft hull where the propeller was housed in a semi-tunnel inside the hull itself. This protected it from debris. He also famously designed the rudder to be behind the propeller, so the boat could be steered using the high-pressure prop wash. The result was a boat that could run at high speed in water that was only 18 inches deep. It could slam over logs, run through fields of river grass, and navigate shallow, muddy deltas. It was, for his customers, a miracle boat. But the Eureka, for all its genius, still had a flaw. It had a standard V-shaped bow, or nose. When it ran up onto a muddy riverbank to unload men or equipment, it would get stuck. The crew would have to rock it back and forth to get it free, just like the Navy's failed designs. Higgins, obsessed with efficiency, hated this. He went back to his workshop and designed a new bow. It was a strange, concave, spoonbill shape. This new design would run up onto a riverbank, and then, when the engine was put in reverse, the water would be channeled under the bow, lifting it and letting it back off the mud, clean, every single time. By 1937, Higgins was selling these Eureka boats with their spoonbill bow and protected propeller to anyone who worked in the swamps. He was a successful but obscure local boat builder. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the United States Marine Corps was in a state of desperation. Their official Navy landing craft were still the 30-foot V-hull death traps. In 1938, a Marine Corps lieutenant, Victor H. Krulak, was tasked with finding a solution. He knew the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, or BUSHIPS, was a dead end. They were obsessed with their own failed designs. So Krulak looked elsewhere. He read everything. He looked at fishing boats in Japan. He looked at pleasure craft. And then, in a copy of Life magazine, he saw a small article. It was about a wonder boat being built in New Orleans, a boat that could run in shallow water and climb onto beaches. He immediately went to his superiors and got permission to go to New Orleans. When Krulak, a professional polished Marine officer, walked into the chaotic, loud and greasy factory of Higgins Industries, he was met by Andrew Higgins himself. Higgins, who was known for his colorful language, probably greeted him with a string of curses and a bottle of whiskey. Krulak explained his problem. He needed a boat that could land men on a beach without wading. Higgins laughed. He took Krulak out to the Mississippi River. He pointed to one of his 36-foot Eureka spoonbill boats and told Krulak to get in. Higgins, at the wheel, then ran the boat at full speed, 25 miles per hour, directly at a muddy riverbank. Krulak, by his own admission, braced for a catastrophic impact. Instead, the boat shot up onto the bank, smooth as glass, and came to a stop, high and dry. Higgins, with a grin, then threw the engine in reverse. The boat lifted itself off the mud and slid back into the river, clean. Krulak was stunned. This was it. This was the miracle. He immediately returned to Washington, his report ecstatic. He had found the boat, but the fight was just beginning, because the Navy's powerful bushships, the old guard admirals and architects, hated it. They hated its spoonbill bow. They hated that it was made of wood, not steel. And most of all, they hated that it was designed by a loudmouthed, uneducated civilian from New Orleans. They declared that the Higgins boat was unseaworthy, flimsy, and unfit for naval service. The Marine Corps, however, finally had a weapon, and they were not going to let it go. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, or bushships, was a fortress of tradition. They did not like their plans being challenged, especially not by a Marine lieutenant and a civilian boat builder from the swamps. For almost 2 years, from 1939 to 1941, a bureaucratic war was waged. The Marines, backed by a few forward-thinking officers in the Navy's Bureau of Ships, championed the Higgins Eureka boat. Bushships, meanwhile, continued to pour money into its own failed 30-foot V-hull design. The admirals in Washington argued that the Higgins boat, made of plywood, could not survive the open ocean. They argued that its spoonbill bow was a gimmick. Higgins, who was a master self-promoter, fought back. He took his boat out into the Gulf of Mexico during a storm, filmed it cutting through 10-foot waves, and sent the film directly to the admirals. But the real turning point came in 1941, at the Fleet Board trials at Quantico, Virginia. The Navy was finally forced to hold a bake-off. It was the official Navy prototype versus the Higgins Eureka. It wasn't a competition. It was an embarrassment. The Navy's boat was slow. It was loud. It lumbered toward the beach, hit a sandbar 50 yards out, and got hopelessly stuck. The crew, in a panic, couldn't get it to back off the sand. Then it was Higgins's turn. The Eureka, with a Marine crew, came roaring in at high speed. It shot past the stuck Navy boat, raced through the shallow surf, and slid up high and dry onto the sand. The Marines inside hopped out, ran onto the beach, and then hopped back in. The pilot threw the engine in reverse, and the boat slid cleanly back into the water. To add insult to injury, the Higgins boat then circled back and was used to tow the Navy's official multi-million-dollar prototype off the sandbar. The admirals on the beach were silent. The argument was over. The evidence was undeniable. The Navy, begrudgingly, had to admit that this swamp boat was the only boat that worked. They placed an order for this new Landing Craft Personnel, or LCP. But the story wasn't over, because the Marines, in winning this battle, had discovered a new problem. The boat worked. It could get them to the beach, but it was still not a perfect assault craft. Why? Because the men had to get out. The Eureka boat had high plywood sides, designed to keep water out. This meant that a platoon of 30 heavily armed Marines, under fire, had to scramble one by one over the top. They had to throw a leg over the gunwale, exposing themselves to enemy fire, and then jump down onto the sand. It was slow, it was clumsy, and it was a bottleneck that would get men killed. Higgins now had the contract, but the Marines came back to him with this new, impossible problem. They needed a boat that could run onto the beach and also unload 30 men instantly from the front. Higgins was stuck. The reason his spoonbill bow worked so well was because it was a single, strong, concave piece of wood. It was what allowed the boat to back off the mud. If he cut a hole in it, he would destroy his own brilliant design. The solution, according to legend, came to Higgins in a flash of inspiration. His son, in an interview, claimed that Higgins was studying a picture of a freshwater ramped boat used on the lakes of Illinois. Other stories say he was looking at a picture of a new Japanese landing craft that had a crude two-piece clamshell door. Whatever the spark, Higgins had his eureka moment. He didn't need to cut a hole in his bow. He needed to replace his bow. He went back to his draftsman and, in a single, frantic 72-hour design session, he created the final, war-winning design. He kept the revolutionary protected propeller hull, but he cut off the spoonbill bow. In its place, he put a wide, flat steel ramp operated by a simple pulley system. This ramp, he reasoned, would be the new bow. It would run up onto the beach, and then, as it dropped, it would serve as both an exit and a bridge over any small obstacles. He built a prototype in just 60 hours. He called it the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, the LCVP. It was perfect. It was the solution to the Gallipoli problem. It was the miracle boat the Marines had been dreaming of for 20 years. This was the boat that would win the war. Andrew Higgins had his perfect boat. But the admirals at the Navy's Bureau of Ships in Washington were furious. Higgins had just solved their impossible problem. But in doing so, he had just made their new boat, the LCP he had just won the contract for, completely obsolete before it had even entered mass production. Higgins, with his new LCVP ramp design, was essentially telling the Navy to tear up its brand new contracts and start all over again. The admirals in bushships tried to block him. They claimed this new ramp boat was structurally unsound. They claimed the ramp mechanism would jam with sand. They argued that stopping production to retool for this new design would set the entire war effort back by a year. It was the old guard, fighting one last desperate battle to save their pride and their own failed internal designs. But Andrew Higgins was not just an engineering genius. He was a political brawler. He did not just wait for approval. He took his own money, and without a government contract, he built the first production LCVPs himself. He then bypassed the admirals entirely. He went straight to the politicians. He went to Congress. He went to the press. He famously took out full-page ads in newspapers, publicly shaming the Navy's Bureau of Ships, accusing them of criminal negligence and sabotaging the war effort by clinging to their death-trap boat designs. It was an unprecedented high-stakes gamble. He was a lone civilian, publicly attacking the most powerful admirals in the US Navy during a war, but the evidence was on Higgins's side. The Marine Corps, which was now in a life-or-death struggle in the Pacific at Guadalcanal, was screaming for the new ramped boat. They saw the reports. They knew it was the weapon that would save their lives. Finally, in late 1942, the Admiral's old guard was broken. The political pressure was too great. The battlefield reports were too clear. The Navy capitulated. They officially cancelled all other landing craft designs and made the Higgins LCVP the one and only standard amphibious landing craft for the entire Allied war effort. And then they turned to Andrew Higgins and gave him an order that was in itself impossible. They told this small New Orleans boat builder that they needed thousands of these boats. They needed them for the invasion of Sicily. They needed them for the invasion of Italy. They needed them for the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. And they needed them for a top-secret, massive operation being planned for 1944. An operation that would require an armada of over 1,000 of his boats to be delivered all at once. An operation codenamed Overlord. Higgins, in his typical fashion, reportedly cursed at the admirals, told them their timeline was insane, and then said, yes. What happened next was one of the greatest industrial miracles of the Second World War. In 1938, Higgins Industries was a small local company with less than 200 employees, building a few dozen boats a year. By 1943, Higgins Industries had exploded. Andrew Higgins built 8 brand new, massive factories in and around New Orleans. He employed 25,000 workers. He was no longer just a boat builder. He was the head of a logistical empire. He invented the world's first modern assembly line for building boats. Before Higgins, boats were built one at a time, from the keel up by master craftsmen. Higgins, inspired by Henry Ford, built the LCVPs on a moving production line. The wooden hulls were assembled upside down on massive rolling jigs, and his workforce was revolutionary. Because he was in New Orleans, he defied the Jim Crow segregation laws of the South. He hired African American workers and paid them the same wage as white workers, a decision that was almost unheard of. He hired women, older workers, and people with disabilities. He famously said, "I don't care who you are or what you look like. If you can do the job, you've got a job." His factories were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the numbers are staggering. By the end of the war, Higgins Industries, this once tiny swamp boat company, had built 23,358 boats. That is more than the entire number of ships in the US Navy combined. He had built the impossible boat, and then he had built an impossible army of them. And as 1944 dawned, that armada was being gathered, in secret, in the ports of southern England. The swamp boat was about to meet its destiny. June 6th, 1944. Dawn. The coast of Normandy. The largest amphibious armada in human history, over 5,000 ships, was gathered in the churning grey waters of the English Channel. For the men of the 1st, 4th, and 29th Infantry Divisions, huddled in the transport ships, this was the impossible moment. They were about to do the one thing military doctrine had screamed was suicide for 20 years, a frontal assault, on a heavily defended beach. The German defences, the Atlantic Wall, were formidable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months planting tens of thousands of obstacles in the surf. There were Belgian gates, massive steel frames designed to rip the bottom out of a boat. There were log ramps, angled and mined, and behind them, on the bluffs of Omaha and Utah, were the machine gun nests, the mortars, and the 88mm cannons, all pre-sighted on the exact patches of water the Allies would have to cross. This was Gallipoli, times 1,000. And the only thing that stood between this operation and a catastrophe that would have dwarfed 1915 was Andrew Higgins's swamp boat. As the order was given to load the craft, The LCVPs were lowered from the transport ships into the heavy 10-foot swells. The men, loaded with 80 pounds of gear, had to climb down slippery cargo nets, timing their drop into the boats that were crashing violently against the steel hulls. The boats, each with 30 GIs packed in like sardines, shoulder to shoulder, then formed into waves. The coxswain, a young Navy or Coast Guard reserve, peered through his small, armoured viewport. His job was to navigate a 5-mile run, through a minefield, through artillery, and through Rommel's devil's garden of obstacles, all while being shot at. This is where the genius of the Higgins boat became the key to survival. The German artillery, firing from the cliffs, was deadly, but the LCVPs were fast. They were small, plywood targets, moving at 12 knots. They were hard to hit. And as they reached the surf zone, the impossible part of their design took over. The coxswains, following channels cleared by Navy frogmen, could not see the bottom, but they didn't need to. The recessed tunnel propeller that Higgins had invented for the Louisiana swamps allowed them to skim over sandbars that would have stopped any other boat. They raced through water that was only 2 or 3 feet deep. They dodged the log ramps. They shouldered aside smaller obstacles, and then, with a lurch and a grinding thud, they hit the beach. This was the moment of truth. This was the failure point of Gallipoli. But there was no wading. There was no climbing over the sides. The coxswain, safe in his steel-plated cockpit, pulled a single lever. The pulley system engaged, and the front of the boat, the entire steel bow, fell forward. Wham! The ramp hit the sand, often in water that was only waist deep, or even ankle deep. The 30 men inside, who had been compressed and terrified, exploded out. They didn't come out one by one, like at Gallipoli. They came out as a squad, in 3 seconds, all at once, their rifles already up. They had a bridge. They had a foothold. But this was only half of the miracle. The first wave of men was now on the beach. They were pinned down, fighting for their lives at the shingle, the wall of sand and stone at the high tide mark. The battle for Normandy was not going to be won by the first 30,000 men. It was going to be won by the next 100,000. It was a battle of logistics. And now, the Higgins boat performed its second impossible act. The coxswain, after dropping his men, hit the engine. He threw it into full reverse. The legacy of the old spoonbill bow, the flared hull design that Higgins had kept, now channeled the prop wash under the boat. It lifted the light, plywood hull off the sand, and the LCVP slid cleanly back into the surf. It did not get stuck. While the first wave was fighting and dying, the LCVPs were already racing back to the transports. They were a shuttle. They were a high-speed conveyor belt. They picked up the second wave of infantry. They picked up the combat engineers. They picked up the medics. And then, Higgins's other designs came in. The LCM, or landing craft, mechanized, a bigger version of his boat, dropped its ramp, and a 30-ton Sherman tank would roar out onto the beach. Another LCVP would hit the sand, drop its ramp, and a jeep would drive off, pulling a 37mm anti-tank gun. Another would land, and soldiers would run out carrying, not rifles, but boxes of ammunition, cases of blood plasma and radio batteries. This was the impossible problem solved. This was not a static, suicidal landing. It was a continuous high-speed flow of men and material. The Higgins boat was the blood vessel of the entire invasion. Without it, the men on the beach would have been cut off, surrounded, and annihilated, just as they had been at Gar.